So nice to see you all again today, and thanks for coming. It's a warmer and nicer day out. It's a real honor and pleasure to be able to introduce second time Dr. Alonso Ramirez from North Carolina State University. Alonso spent his graduate degree work at the University of Georgia, and then got a professorship at the University of Puerto Rico, where he spent a full 17 years, and in the last 3 years has moved to North Carolina State University, and is thriving there, works in both in Puerto Rico and Costa Rica mostly, and is just getting ready to launch major research in urban streams in North Carolina. We found out at lunch today, or that's what the future holds. So yesterday we got to hear about the forested stream and the impacts of these ephemeral, intense climatic events. And today we're going to move to a flashier, more impervious watershed and hear about some of the impacts on urban streams. And I think there'll be some really fascinating parallels. But before we start, I'd like to present Alonso with our official small batch artisanal craft Fort Collins plaque. So Alonso, if you'd come to the stage. We'll get a picture that way. Okay, so there you go.
All right, thank you.
Did we get one? Should we do it again? Should we pose again?
Nice.
Okay.
I'll put it down.
Okay, I'll take it for you. We'll get it back if the talk goes well. Okay, with no further ado, Dr. Alonso Ramirez.
So thank you for the introduction, and again, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I'm really happy that the weather improved, and it was kind of chilly yesterday, but today things are looking much better. Can you guys hear me well if okay, perfect. So let me get my pointer. All right, you should be able to see the laser pointer there. All right, so I'm gonna be talking about urban streams, but in a similar way that I did yesterday. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Puerto Rico before. I'm just assuming that you guys don't know Puerto Rico. You should go to Puerto Rico, it's fun. And it's warm. And then I'll tell you about climate change and how droughts and hurricanes are on the horizon. And then our work in urban streams. And I'll tell you a little bit about our plans for future research in urban settings. So let's start with Puerto Rico. And here I'm gonna also take the advantage to just highlight the other projects that we have in the lab. So Puerto Rico, right there in the middle of the Caribbean, it's our main study site. We have been working in Puerto Rico for a while now, but the other place where I work long-term is in Costa Rica, in part because it's a really cool place to work because I grew up there, and so I get an excuse to fly back and visit my family and do research. So that's one of my other study sites. And then I'm collaborating with people in the Institute of Ecology in Mexico, studying riparian vegetation and stream ecosystems. So most of our lab work is around the Caribbean area, with Mexico perhaps a little to the side, but it's kind of like our geographic location. So back to Puerto Rico. Yesterday, I mentioned our work in El Yunque. This green area here, that's a national forest. It's the only tropical forest within the US system. It is also the site of the Luquillo LTR program, so it's a long-term research ecological site that started in 1988, so there's good long-term data for many variables, meteorological stuff, and vegetation, water chemistry, and things like that. So very, very good place to work. But for some reason, the streams in Puerto Rico are super nice. They look like more or less like this. This is the stream that I showed yesterday, adding the fish. So this is kind of downstream from waterfalls. I mentioned yesterday that waterfalls are blocking the movement of fish, so you have these big predators only downstream from waterfalls. So these systems are super interesting. They have a lot of unique species, really exciting. The native shrimp and the native fish are migratory, so they have this amphidromous life cycle. They develop, or most of them have adult populations that are present in the river, and the larvae migrates to the estuary, where they develop into juveniles that have to migrate back into the river. So it's kind of like salmons, but backwards. Except for eels, that for some reason they have to swim to the ocean. They have a meeting place somewhere in the Sargassum Sea. They reproduce there, and then the juveniles have to find some river somewhere. So they are catadromous. So, I mean, that's kind of like the natural system, super exciting, a lot of research. But the other thing with Puerto Rico is that it's very urban. So this is a picture showing Puerto Rico from the International Space Station. So if you guys use your imagination, it's like a rectangle, but this bright spot right there, that's the San Juan metropolitan area. Right next to Puerto Rico, it's the Dominican Republic, and you only see the lights of Santo Domingo. You don't see the outline of the island like Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is kind of like the shining star of the Caribbean when you look from space. It's really bright. And of course, light is not urbanization, but they are very closely related. So I like to show this, this map also to highlight that. So the map at the top is showing the stream network on the island. So all the blue lines in this figure are the rivers and streams. And the one at the bottom are the roads. So that's all roads, highways, little roads, like, you know, everything where you can drive through, it's there. If you imagine those two overlapping one another, I mean, it is impacting every single stream. So it's like if you're working in stream ecology in Puerto Rico, it's impossible to ignore human impacts. And this is the map of urban areas. The big spot here is the San Juan metropolitan area. So, you know, when I moved to Puerto Rico, you know, being from Costa Rica, I went straight to the rainforest right there. So, you know, those are the clean rivers, those are the fun ones. But all my students were like, let's go to San Juan, you know, let's go to the urban area. That's where the important questions are because of conservation or management, et cetera. So we start working in urban rivers, mostly, I guess, the fault of my students that wanted to work in them. But they end up being really interesting. I'll show you about it in a minute. The other thing that is really interesting of doing urban work in Puerto Rico is that Puerto Rico is a tropical island. It is an oceanic island, so biodiversity is much reduced. It's more simple. But it's a good place to project what could happen in other tropical areas if you manage part of those urban impacts. So this graph is a little small, but the red line is showing the urban population in Puerto Rico, and the green line is showing the rural population in Puerto Rico. So the number of people that live in urban versus rural areas. You might not be able to see the years, but 2000 is here, 2020 is right there. So by now, most of the island, most of the people in Puerto Rico are living in places that could be considered urban. The definition of urbanization is a little different depending on whether you talk to an ecologist or a sociologist or, you know, people that work with the census. So there are multiple definitions. But most people in Puerto Rico are really close to a city or a town. If we compare that with the population in the Caribbean and Latin America, Puerto Rico here, the blue line, it's already almost 100%, or basically 100% urban. The red line is Latin America, so it's heading in that direction, but it's not there. and the other Caribbean is also heading in that direction. So to some degree, Puerto Rico is like a window to the future for Latin America. So it presents a really useful opportunity to understand urban rivers, and then picture how urban rivers might be in other Latin American places if you manage some of the major impacts. And those impacts are basically sewage. A lot of countries, a lot of cities in Latin America still dump a lot of raw sewage into the rivers. So when you go to a city, urban rivers are basically sewage collectors, and they are super impacted. Puerto Rico cannot do that because it is associated with the US, and they have to follow the Clean Water Act to some degree. So the impacts are lower. So they collect the sewage. They actually dump it into the ocean. So it is, there's some pretreatment. It's not great, but at least they don't dump it into the river. So we can work in urban rivers that are impacted by urbanization, but are not just really flooded with sewage. There are some leakage and some illegal connections, but it's not that bad. And they kind of look like this. So some stretches of the urban streams that we study are looking really kind of like natural. So you see the substrate is heterogeneous. You see riffles and pools. So they don't look that bad. Some are more like this other example at the right that is a channelized stream. You see that there isn't a lot of habitat heterogeneity, but there's little concrete, and some of them are just channels. Similar to the rainforest, they are really flashy. So here's the hydrograph for the Rio Piedras, one of our study streams. It goes up and down like crazy. People like to say that Puerto Rico is drier from January to May, but you don't really see it in that figure. So it is really flashy. It goes up and down, and that's very normal for urban streams, but it's also normal for forest streams in Puerto Rico. So natural and urban streams are really flashy in Puerto Rico, and that's important because that, I think, explains the fauna that we find in these urban rivers. All right, so what's going to be happening with climate change? Let me get the first. So the first thing is that climate models predict an increase in drought events. Droughts are really rare in the Caribbean, and that was part of the discussion that we had yesterday. We had a drought in 1994 and then one in 2015, so you can picture that droughts are really rare events. This is a really rainy part of the Caribbean and really rainy side of Puerto Rico as well. And droughts, like this reservoir, like really low in water, are rare. But they are supposed to become more frequent in the future. And then hurricanes, the model or the projections are for more severe storms or high category storms hitting the Caribbean in the future. So that will create quite a bit of disturbance. So more intense events, large hurricanes. And as I mentioned yesterday, we had a drought in 2015 and then a major hurricane in 2017 that were like, really major events that affected the population of Puerto Rico, but it also provided a great opportunity for us to study the effects of drought and the effects of hurricanes, and that's what I'm gonna be sharing with you. So again, the drought, I showed this figure yesterday. It was a pan-Caribbean drought, so affected the entire Caribbean, the islands, and Central America, and also the northern part of South America. So the whole region in brown was affected during the drought. The rainforest streams became a series of isolated pools. So flow basically stopped, and you got pools with water, then a dry stretch of a stream bed, and then another pool. So instead of a flowing ecosystem, you end up with a chain of little pools. So that was 2015. Then in 2017, we got Hurricane Maria hitting Puerto Rico. That was a really active year for storms. There were like 18 tropical depressions and 17 storms, 6 major hurricanes, and one of those was Maria that crossed Puerto Rico. So here's the path of Maria crossing Puerto Rico right through the middle. That's the university after the hurricane. That's my office right there in that building. It was a good way to clean the office and get rid of old papers and books that I never read, all gone. I mean, the good thing with hurricanes is that you see them coming. You get a good warning. So I moved most of my things to the lab that is in a basement, so I didn't really lose a lot, but we lost the building. For the streams, it kind of looks like this. Mostly damage to the riparian vegetation. So the channel, the stream doesn't really suffer major changes. This is one of the urban rivers. You can see that it's well channelized, and all the riparian vegetation disturbed on the ground without leaves due to the storm. And they recover quickly. So here's a few months later, you see trees with branches. It's more like a year and a half later. But you see that the vegetation is growing back. So again, the future holds, I guess, more drought events and more hurricanes, and that's the main concern that we have. So let's look at urban responses. Again, macroinvertebrates, like I talked about yesterday, but I'm gonna be adding fish to this one because we are downstream from dams in the coastal area, so fish play an important role. So our work is in the San Juan metropolitan area. This is in the map of Puerto Rico, San Juan is right there. This is the Rio Piedras watershed. If you guys are familiar with Puerto Rico, the airport is right here. Old San Juan is over here. So anybody that went on a cruise and stopped in Puerto Rico, stop in Old San Juan. It's a really pretty part of town. I think it's the oldest city in the US. It was built by the Spanish crown, back in the day. And this is the Rio Piedras watershed. The University of Puerto Rico is right there. So when I was working there, it was super convenient. We had, we went to the river in the morning and, teach in the afternoon. I remodeled my lab and included a shower, so that was very useful. So that was very, very convenient. It's very heavily urbanized, so all this great stuff is developed, or basically built-up terrain. Some rural suburban areas in the upper part. This is the Botanical Garden. So you can see that it's a very urbanized watershed. This dot here represents our long-term study site. That's where we have been working for several years now. And looks like this from above. So you can see that it's an stretch of river with quite a bit of riparian vegetation, but the urban development is right there, right next to the river. Same upstream and downstream from this part of the river. So we have been sampling there for a while. We started sampling macroinvertebrates in 2008, and we kept going. We have the drought in 2015, and then the hurricane in 2017. So it's a long-term project studying benthic macroinvertebrates in this urban stretch. If we look at the drought year, you can see that the water was low, the riparian vegetation was still in good shape, and you start seeing a lot of algal growth because of the lack of flooding. So basically, the river has an excess of nutrient and enough sunlight for algae to grow, but in a regular year, there's a lot of flooding that scours the algae. So during the drought, we started to see these patches of green at the edge of the pools that are basically algae growing thanks to the lack of disturbance. And then this is how the same place looked after the hurricane. So the channel, it's basically the same with more water because it was a wet year, but the riparian vegetation is very damaged. So let me tell you about the fauna that lives there. Macroinvertebrates are diverse. So again, we started working in this river thinking that it's super impacted, that we were going to find only a few tolerant taxa. And we actually were very surprised to find a lot of fauna. So we have the expected pollution tolerant groups like snails. These are introduced snails, oligochaetes, and leeches, and also your standard chironomids. These red guys that are tolerant to low oxygen are very abundant. But also you get all these other groups. So you get mayflies and caddisflies, and I mean, those are supposed to be indicators of super good water quality. So you're like, what are you guys doing here? You know, it says you didn't read the book. You were supposed to be in the forest, not here. And we think that it has to do with the flashiness as well. You know, it is a river that builds up a lot of pollution because it's urban, but all that rain might be just kind of like resetting the system, and maybe they don't get exposed to pollution for a very long period of time. Maybe they get exposed to pollution for short periods of time. So that was a surprise, the fact that we were finding a lot of taxa that is supposed to be sensitive. Let's look at the disturbance. So here's precipitation. This precipitation data is for the rainforest. So 2015 is the drought year. And if you guys are familiar with precipitation values, you can see that the drought year had a lot of rain. So, you know, for some places, that's plenty of water. For Puerto Rico, that's a drought. The thing with Puerto Rico is that it's a small island, really steep, so all that precipitation falls and moves into the ocean quickly. So if you don't have the infrastructure, like reservoirs, to hold the water, you don't have enough water to provide people with drinking water. So that dip in precipitation created a serious problem to the point that, you know, we had water twice a week only during the peak of the drought. The other year that I want to highlight is 2017. That's the hurricane year. That's when the Hurricane Maria hit the island. And the point that I want to make is that it wasn't a super rainy year either. So we got this storm, but it wasn't an outlier in terms of precipitation. If we look at the hydrograph, again, it's flashy. So you get these peaks. So it rains, the river goes up, then it goes down, then it rains, and you get another spike. And again, that's normal for the urban, and it's normal for the rainforest. But during the drought, you see that the number of peaks are few. During the hurricane year, you get a lot more peaks, and a lot of them were before the hurricane. And then we have Hurricane Irma hitting Puerto Rico before Maria, and then Maria destroyed the monitoring station, and we don't know what happened. But mostly because of the wind. So the wind was the main impact of Hurricane Maria. The flood was a big flood. It was a very large flood, but floods are the norm for this watershed. You see those big peaks anyway. So let's look at the macroinvertebrates in a similar way that I showed it yesterday. So February 2015, it's this bar here before the drought. This is abundance of macroinvertebrates in individuals per square meter. The drought is 2015, and we got a decrease in the number of macroinvertebrates. So if you guys remember, I should make a quiz. If you guys remember yesterday, there was a spike in macroinvertebrates, and that was mostly oligochaetes that were able to deal with low oxygen. In the Rhopideras, we got the opposite pattern, And we think that is because we have predatory fishes there. So in the rainforest, we have shrimp, but shrimp can crawl and they can walk around and they got out of there. They basically walked downstream until they found a deep pool. So the tributary that we were studying in Puerto Rico didn't have shrimp present. This river, the urban river, had fish, predatory fish present. So I think that that's the main driver here. We need to test it, but that's the hypothesis. And then we had the hurricane. So I showed you the hydrology, that 2017 was very rainy, so the river was going up and down. So you can also see the macroinvertebrates going up and down, responding to the hydrological disturbance. Then we got the hurricane right there in September. We sample again in October, and again in February. And you see a small number of macroinvertebrates right after the hurricane, maybe because of the flood, but they recovered quickly, and by February they were in high numbers. So if you look at the whole thing, there's a lot of variability there, but the thing that kind of stands out is the fact that the peak of the drought in July was very low in abundance of macroinvertebrates. If we look at the assemblage composition in ordination space, so again, ordination, if you have points that are close to each other, like October and May here, they have similar macroinvertebrate assemblages in terms of composition and abundance. If they are distant from each other, then they are very different in terms of their abundance and composition. So you see the drought, the peak of the drought, July 2015. That's October, right after the hurricane, and October is close to the cloud of points, so it's within the normal variability, but the drought is way to the side. And then February 2018, the last one that I showed you of data, that is kind of towards the other side, and we think that this might be driven by algae and kind of the story that I made yesterday, that the canopy is open, there's more sunlight, so there's more algae, and this might be the result of more, an increase in organisms that consume algae. And I'm not gonna expand on this. We talk about it a little bit with the rainforest. I'm gonna move into fish because there's a really interesting story here. So again, we started studying fish in 2008. We had the drought in 2015 and then the hurricane in 2017. And a lot of students that help electroshock, and that's a lot of fun. So you always get a lot of volunteers to do that. They like to dress like Ghostbusters. So let me tell you about the fish fauna. So again, we started working in the urban river thinking that we were going to find only introduced species, species tolerant to pollution, or maybe aquarium dumps, that type of thing. And we were super surprised that we found all the native fishes of Puerto Rico living in the urban river in abundances that were similar than the rivers draining the rainforest of El Yunque. So it's like, again, they didn't read the book. So they were supposed to be excluded from this urban river. But again, they are amphidromous, so they can deal with the ocean and with the freshwater. So maybe they are pre-adapted somehow to the impacts of urbanization, to the higher nutrients, higher solutes in the water. But we find there are 9 native fish species, freshwater species in Puerto Rico, and they all live happy in the urban river. I should mention that all the fish part is a collaboration with Gus Ekman. Gus did a master's with me in Puerto Rico, then went to North Carolina and did his PhD there, and he's now a faculty professor at the University of Tennessee. But he continued working in Puerto Rico, so he's my fish collaborator. So I don't have to worry about fish. So these are the natives, they are there, and we also find non-natives, introduced species. Cichlids, for example, there are several species of cichlids. Poecilids that are everywhere. And these big guys, plecos, these are probably aquarium dumps. People buy them to clean the algae from their fish tank and then release them into the river. And they go from this big to this big. They are really huge. So they are there in the urban river as well. At the beginning of this study, none of them was very abundant. So let me show you the data. So again, this is abundance. So this is the number of individuals starting in 2008. So this is an annual sampling that we do in the Rio Piedras during summer. And then here we have the drought and then the hurricane. I'll show you the data in a minute. And this is divided in natives, that's the black part of the column, and introduced, which is the gray part of the column. So we do triple pass electroshocking and all that, but here I just added all of them just to simplify this story. So big surprise, we started sampling the urban river, and the black part of this column was the dominant one. So native species were doing well in the urban river. There were few introduced, and everybody seemed to be happy, like kind of behaving like a natural river. And then the drought hit. And we sampled during the drought, and that flipped the coin. And then the gray part became larger than the black part. So we got a lot more individuals, and this is just abundance, not species richness. So we got a lot more individuals of introduced species rather than natives. And the big difference was this one species. So during the drought, or the drought basically opened the door to this Amphilopus red devil to get established in the Rio Piedras. We knew about it because this is a fish that is introduced in reservoirs for fishing. They are colorful, and so they are fun to fish. But they were never present in the river. And we think that the flashiness of the river kept them out, so they do well in reservoirs, but not in a flashy river. But then the drought changed the river from a flashy system to a more stable system. And they got there, and they became established. So 2015, we found a lot of them. In 2016, they were there. And in 2017, before the hurricane, they were still, the number of fish that we got that year was lower, but they were still the dominant group. So most of the gray bar is basically Amphilopus, and then a few poecilids and a few of other groups, but dominated completely by Amphilopus. So before I show you the rest of the data, let me tell you more about this red devil. There are two species, and we think that they are already a hybrid in the Rio Piedras because they are present together, and it's really hard to tell them apart. They are native from Central America, from the lakes in Nicaragua. The two major lakes in Nicaragua are their home. They're really pretty. They get this orange color, but there are different morphs. The normal, let's say, is the standard kind of cichlid color that is more grayish with black bands or bars. And you have a kind of transitional to gold, and then the orange gold that is the one that we see in the Rio Piedras a lot. So you get the whole spectrum of colors. They have been introduced in different places, so they are known in Hawaii, in Puerto Rico, of course. They are native to Central America, but they were introduced in Costa Rica and in other parts of the tropics. And this picture is from PetSmart, so you can actually buy it in an aquarium. And of course, if you get tired of the aquarium, you can release it into the wild, right? So just dump it into the river, and we end up with them. So back to the Rio Piedras, that's how the river looked like. And when we set up the nets for the electrofishing, you see them all over the place. They are really, really abundant. And they can get fairly large. So you can kind of get an idea there with the picture, so they can get like maybe this big. So they are an important component of the ecosystem. And this is a small video that I made with a GoPro. They're pretty. Anybody here has cichlids in their home, in a fish tank? You are all too good. But it's hard to keep them. So oftentimes you can keep only a few of similar size because cichlids are very aggressive. So I'm gonna show you this video. This is a pair that are protecting their nest right there on this rock. It's not the best video, but I think it conveys the idea. So pay attention to the orange one. I'm not sure if it's the male or the female, but it's the smallest of the pair. Just protecting their territory, and if somebody gets too close, coming soon. There you go. You see that they chase them. So it's not again, it's not the best video. I need to get I don't know. It is an urban river, so you don't want to stick your head in there. But they are very aggressive. They are always chasing each other, and of course, they probably chase the native species as well. So they are probably competing and maybe also consuming some of the natives. So we were hoping to get rid of them with the hurricane. You know, hurricane created a big flood, so we were hoping to that the hurricane created a flood large enough to exterminate the population. And it kind of looked like that. So right after the hurricane, so this second column here, it's our sampling in October, right after the hurricane. And you don't see much of a difference. You see that it's still dominated by the cichlid. But the next year, in 2018, we got a peak in natives and a smaller proportion of the cichlids. So we were like, you know, maybe it's getting in the right direction. Maybe they didn't get flushed by the hurricane, but they were impacted. So we went back in 2019, and nope, they are still there. We couldn't sample during 2020, but in 2021, these cichlids are still the dominant group. And I should mention that Bonnie Myers is our grad student in this project. She's analyzing this in a more scientific way than what I'm doing. So she's doing all the hydrology and looking at the relationship between fish and hydrology and all that. I just like to tell this story. So here's, again, an ordination analysis. The black are the years before the drought, and you see the assemblage is dominated by natives, so it's towards one side. After the drought, that is in red, the assemblages shifted and were dominated by this invasive red devil. And after the hurricane, it kind of went back a little in 2018, but you see that the rest of the blue years are towards the right. Okay, so take-home messages. Again, similar than the messages from yesterday. We consider droughts the more extreme events. So droughts are causing really unusual conditions in these rivers that are not experiencing drought on a regular basis. So droughts are having a major impact on the stream ecosystem and the biotic assemblages. And the worst, or the main impact was the opening for invasives to become established, and the fact that they were able to stay there after the drought. So kind of the drought played the key role to switch the ecosystem to a different state, and then it kind of stayed like that. The hurricanes are creating a big flood, and that's one more flood in this system, so the fauna is adapted to that, so no surprise. And then I guess the main concern is what will happen with these ecosystems that are doing fairly well if drought becomes more frequent, and then the degradation might start to appear more evident, when more invasives become established. Right now, our main concern is to understand better this cichlid and what's the impact on the ecosystem. So in terms of future steps, Gus and I are starting a project. They are actually sampling in Puerto Rico right now, where we are going to remove the Amphilopus, electroshocking them out of stretches of river to do a manipulation to assess the effects of Amphilopus on the ecosystem. So because cichlids are so aggressive and they are very omnivorous, we think that if we focus on the bottom figure first, we think that they are affecting the aquatic insects very directly because they can prey upon them, also shrimp, and they'll be also consuming detritus and algae that are the basis of the food web. So we're basically assuming that those cichlids are affecting everybody, and they are probably outcompeting native fish either by excluding them from parts of the river, or maybe even by consuming some of the small ones. So the idea is to remove the fish to see if we get back to the more expected food web with the natives dominating, shrimp being present, but in low numbers because of predation by native fish, and then insects and the algae. So the idea or the project started this spring. We managed to sample the different places for macroinvertebrates, and Gus is removing fish right now. So we're going back during summer to resample those stretches to see whether we can understand better those impacts of Amphilopus on the ecosystem and the macroinvertebrates. And that's the story. So thanks for listening. If you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Testing. Hi, I was curious, earlier in your presentation, you had the graphs on the shift from urbanization, or from rural areas to urbanization. I was curious just because in the US, the pattern of urbanization is people moving away from rural areas into urban areas. In Puerto Rico, is it similar where people are moving from rural to urban, or things are just urbanizing everywhere?
Both. At the beginning, so I guess I need to tell a little bit of history. Puerto Rico was kind of like any other tropical country. It had an economy based on agriculture, so there was a lot of deforestation. And because agriculture kind of required people to spread around, so the cities were fairly small. In the 1940s, the U.S. government decided to industrialize Puerto Rico and try to make it an example of how a tropical region could become industrial and improve their quality of life. So they gave a bunch of tax breaks to companies to establish in Puerto Rico. And the result was that a bunch of new jobs appear associated with urban areas, and people start moving from rural areas to the cities to work on those jobs. And the side effect is that they abandoned especially marginal agricultural land, and the amount of forest on the island started to increase, which is pretty unique. So instead of having deforestation, suddenly Puerto Rico was being reforested, secondary forest mostly. But that was in the 1940s, 50s. By now, it's more like all interconnected with roads, people commuting, and it gets a little crazy. Like there's people that spend 1 hour each way. I mean, that's not unusual for big cities, but people that drive quite a bit to go to their work. So it's like the cities might be the centers for jobs, and people commute from quite a distance. So most of the island is kind of like a suburban type of thing, with a few places more rural. There's still agriculture in Puerto Rico, but most of the food is imported, which is also another problem for, for just basically security. So both.
Thanks, Alonso. That was a cool talk. I was just curious, coming from a logistics perspective, in such a flashy stream, how are you guys manipulating the cichlids? So are you, it just sounds challenging. Are you putting in nets, or what are you doing to do that manipulation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, the plan is to electroshock them out of reaches that are kind of like divided by roads with culverts or something that are like a natural barrier. So we're basically removing them from one place and hoping that they do not recolonize very quickly. But we don't know how long it's gonna last. So this is kind of like preliminary data to really understand the system and try to decide how to do it. So we started with the easiest way. So just removing them without doing anything, building anything, just picking places where you have like a culvert or some barrier already in place that will reduce their chances to recolonize quickly. We'll see how that goes. If, it might be that the next day they are back there, but crossing our fingers that it's gonna take them a few months so we can at least understand a little bit of the impacts. Second phase might require more work and money. Tricky.
So that was very interesting, Alonso. From sort of the invertebrate perspective, I was curious about the recovery, how quickly the invertebrates recovered and how sensitive they might be and to changing, disturbance regimes. And I noticed that a lot of your invertebrates are very small and potentially, multiple generations per year given the climate there. And so when I think about disturbance, I wonder, are things moving off to shelters or refugia and then recolonizing, or do they basically have, adults flying around at all times so that they can quickly, recolonize? And I just wondered how much you knew about, those the fauna and those streams.
Right, great question. For aquatic insects, I think is the fact that they have a short life cycle, so and they don't have any type of seasonality. So you have adults flying and larvae in the water year-round. So you get the drought, and as long as some adults are able to survive and fly around, they'll be able to recolonize or start the process. So it's more like a very resilient type of system where they reproduce quickly and start colonizing the river again. For other groups like snails and shrimp, I think they go to refugia. Like, shrimp are really good at hiding under rocks, which is also an interesting thing because the cichlids use a lot of holes, a lot of spaces under rocks. So I think there's gotta be an interaction between them. It's like the cichlids sort of invading the refugia that native species use during floods. So snails and shrimp can deal with the flooding, and fish can also deal with the flooding. So they are more resistant to floods, but insects are probably more resilient in the sense that they lay eggs after.
Cool, thanks. I guess I'm in charge of finding somebody else to speak.
Thanks, Alonso. I'm curious. These are what you showed yesterday. I mean, these streams are naturally pretty flashy, both the natural streams as well as this urban stream. And I'm wondering if here's my hypothesis. It seems to me that organisms that are adapted to these really flashy conditions would be likewise pre-adapted to stressful conditions, at least in terms of how quickly they can recover and how. So is that just something I'm just throwing out there, or is there something to that?
That's one of our hypotheses, for fish especially and shrimp. The fact that they are there in the urban river kind of means that they can deal with short periods of stress. I need to find a student to test it. So we haven't really done anything. The other hypothesis that we have for fish and shrimp is that they might be we might be seeing like a sourcing type of dynamic. So they might be in the Rheopedras, and the Rheopedra might be a poor habitat, a poor place to be, but because the larvae goes to the ocean, the new colonizers of the watershed might be coming from other watersheds. So the Rio Piedras as a watershed might be a sink for native fish and native shrimp that colonize from the ocean. They don't know better. They just find a river, they start migrating, but they might not find the right conditions. But the populations stay in good numbers because there's a continuous flow of new recruits from another watershed. So that's the other potential hypothesis, I guess, for this system. Again, it'll be interesting to test it. But yeah, we haven't done anything other than that. Yeah, if you know of a student.
Any other question? Oh, Ruth? Oh, sorry. You next.
I have a shrimp biology behavior question. I just found that so fascinating that they'll just get up and start walking downstream.
During the drought, yeah.
Yeah, during a drought, yeah. And that made me wonder things like, oh my gosh, I want to see that. Do you have that on video?
Yeah.
And also, like, do they do it at night? It seems like such a dangerous thing to do, that if I were a bird, I would want to eat those up.
Yeah, they are very nocturnal when there's fish around, especially there has been a couple of studies that show that they can detect whether fish is present or not, kind of chemical cues. And they actually, when they are migrating from the ocean or the estuary upstream, they can select whether to go in one direction or another when they find a fork on the road by smell. So they can detect when a lot of fish here, I go this way. So when fish are present, shrimp are 100% nocturnal. When fish are absent, they are more active at night, but they are very active during the day as well. And I find it fascinating too. It's really cool, and they can actually go from one pool to another. The large macroractian, that is the predator that can be like lobster size, they can actually move from one pool to another, just looking for space, prey, and kind of go back to lower or pools downstream, I guess, if they don't find anything. So they can do the up and down thing. The trick is to mark them because they shed their exoskeleton, so we're having a hard time doing mark recapture. Alan Kovic and Todd Crowell, they have been using elastometers for quite a while, so they kind of color code them, and that works pretty well. But when we tried PID tags or alphanumeric tags, somehow they lose them. I don't know exactly what happened. This is something that we're just starting to try. There's a new faculty from FIU, Rolando, who is Puerto Rican, and he's trying different tagging techniques to try to track these guys better. And he's gonna do it in the flow reduction experiment. So when we reduce flow, we want to know whether they migrate or stay put or what happened.
Cool, that's so
Yeah.
fascinating. Can I follow up with one? I promise I'll be fast. So if I remember correctly, there was a cool study on like toe biters, some big old aquatic bug in flash flooding streams in the Arizona Sky Islands maybe. And they when it starts to rain, they crawl up
They
out of the
run
pools
away.
and hunker down, hold on to something, and then go back in. Do shrimp or do other things in your pools do that?
I haven't seen any cool videos to share, but we do know that they are able to deal with big floods. It's like you sample the river one day, there's a major flood, and right after the flood, they are still there.
Right.
So there gotta be some cue, maybe the change in conductivity or the amount of suspended solids or something that I think trigger a behavior where they go to the under rocks to the bottom of the stream and hide and get out of the way, and then they go out again after the flood. But no data for that. Just I guess another hypothesis that needs to be tested. They are fascinating. There's a lot that you can do with them.
Great, thank you so much. So I just noticed oh, one more, I'm so sorry. Are you sure? Okay.
All right.
Okay, with that, let's thank Alonso so much
Yeah.
for his talks and his great visit. And in just a few weeks, we have our next and last seminar for the semester. So, pair of seminars.
And thanks
Thank you.
everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Have a lovely afternoon.